The metallic shriek cut through the humid Philippine air as mechanics pried open the access hatch of the downed bomber. Lieutenant Commander James Hartley pressed his palm against the fuselage and felt it give slightly under the pressure, like touching the side of a tin can. He withdrew his hand quickly, almost embarrassed, as though he had discovered something he was not meant to see. Around him, a dozen American pilots and engineers stood in the midday heat, staring at the captured Japanese aircraft with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and unease. The bomber had been forced down 2 days earlier near a forward airstrip in Luzon, its crew abandoning the crippled machine before Allied troops arrived. Now it sat under camouflage netting, a prize of war waiting to be dissected. Hartley had flown combat missions against these aircraft for months, watching them streak across the sky in tight formations, dropping ordnance with ruthless precision. He had seen them absorb punishment and keep flying. He had watched his wingmen go down in flames trying to intercept them. In his mind, the enemy bomber had become a symbol of invincibility, a machine built by engineers who understood something Americans did not. But now, standing beside it on solid ground, he realized how little he had truly understood. The skin of the aircraft, the very shell that held it together, was thinner than the metal used on American mail trucks. He could see daylight through tiny imperfections in the riveting. When he tapped the surface with his knuckle, the sound was hollow, almost fragile. This was the machine that had terrorized Pacific skies? This was the bomber that had struck fear into carrier groups and island garrisons? The contradiction was so profound that it felt like a trick, like propaganda designed to demoralize rather than inform. One of the engineers, a wiry sergeant from Kansas named O'Brien, circled the aircraft slowly, running a small measuring tool along the fuselage panels. He stopped near the tail section, crouched low, and pressed the gauge against the metal. When he read the result, he shook his head and called out the thickness in thousandths of an inch. The number hung in the air like an accusation. Hartley did the mental conversion and realized the skin was barely thicker than heavy-duty aluminum foil. He had seen lunch trays on the carrier with more structural integrity. Another pilot, younger and more impulsive, pulled a pocket knife from his flight suit and drove the tip into the fuselage near a seam. The blade punctured the metal with almost no resistance, the sound a soft crunch rather than a metallic scrape. He withdrew the knife and stared at the small hole he had created, his face pale. No one spoke. The implications were too vast, too uncomfortable. If this was the standard of construction, then every burst of machine gun fire, every fragment of shrapnel, every near miss from flak had been far more lethal than anyone had imagined. The Japanese crews had been flying in coffins held together by rivets and prayer. Hartley felt a strange tightness in his chest, a sensation that might have been anger, or might have been something closer to respect. He thought of the bomber formations he had engaged over the Coral Sea, how they had pressed forward despite being shredded by defensive fire, how they had maintained formation even as planes fell away trailing smoke. He had attributed that discipline to fanaticism, to the rigid ideology drilled into enemy pilots. But now, standing beside this fragile machine, he wondered if it had been something else entirely. Perhaps it was not fanaticism that kept them flying. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that there was no armor to protect them, no thickness of steel to absorb punishment. They flew, knowing that survival depended entirely on skill, luck, and the hope that the enemy's aim would falter. The inspection continued as the sun climbed higher, baking the airstrip and turning the camouflage netting into a stifling tent. Engineers measured every panel, photographed every joint, and cataloged every structural element. The wings, designed with obsessive attention to aerodynamic efficiency, were even thinner than the fuselage. The spars were lightweight but elegantly engineered, using internal bracing rather than brute thickness to achieve strength. It was a design philosophy that prioritized speed and range over survivability, a gamble that assumed the bomber would either complete its mission before interception or be destroyed regardless of armor. O'Brien found the fuel tanks and whistled low. They were unarmored, simple bladders of rubberized fabric stretched over lightweight frames. A single tracer round would turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. American bombers, by contrast, carried self-sealing fuel tanks lined with layers of rubber that would swell and close punctures automatically. The Japanese had foregone this protection entirely, shaving weight to extend range. Hartley calculated the trade-off in his mind and realized that this bomber could fly hundreds of miles farther than its American counterparts, but only if it avoided damage entirely. It was a machine designed for a war of perfect execution, a conflict where every mission went according to plan and no enemy fighters appeared at the wrong moment. Inside the cockpit, the instruments were sparse and functional, arranged with a logic that suggested long experience with minimal resources. The controls were lighter than American equivalents, requiring less force to manipulate. This made the aircraft more responsive in the hands of a skilled pilot, but also more prone to overcorrection in turbulence or combat. Hartley slid into the pilot's seat, his hands resting on the yoke, and imagined what it must have been like to fly this machine into combat. The visibility was excellent, the canopy providing a wide field of view, but there was no armor plating behind the seat, no bulletproof glass in the windscreen. The pilot sat exposed, trusting entirely in speed and maneuverability. He thought of the crews he had shot down, the way their aircraft had disintegrated under sustained fire, wings folding, fuselages crumpling, entire sections tearing away in the slipstream. He had assumed they were poorly built, hastily assembled by a nation desperate to match American industrial output. But now he understood the truth was more complex. These aircraft were not poorly built. They were built to a different standard, one that accepted catastrophic vulnerability in exchange for performance advantages. It was not incompetence, it was calculated sacrifice. The oxygen system was rudimentary, little more than a set of bottles and hoses, with no backup or redundancy. The electrical wiring ran exposed along the interior surfaces, bundled loosely and held in place with simple clips. Any battle damage that severed these lines would leave the crew flying blind, without instruments or communication. The defensive armament consisted of a handful of machine guns, manually aimed and fed by limited ammunition. American bombers carried power-operated turrets with interlocking fields of fire, systems so sophisticated they required dedicated gunners and complex mechanical linkages. The Japanese had opted for simplicity, reducing weight and complexity at the cost of defensive capability. O'Brien pulled a section of the skin away from a damaged area, revealing the internal structure. The ribs and stringers were thin, almost delicate, shaped with precision but offering little margin for error. He ran his fingers along a spar and noted hairline cracks radiating from a rivet hole, stress fractures that suggested the airframe was operating near its structural limits even under normal conditions. This was not a machine designed for longevity. It was designed for a specific mission profile, a narrow window of operational parameters, and anything beyond that was considered acceptable loss. The bomb bay doors were made of the same thin aluminum, reinforced with minimal framing. When opened, they added significant drag, but their light weight meant they could be operated quickly. Hartley examined the release mechanism and found it elegantly simple. A mechanical system that required no electrical power and could be operated manually if necessary. It was the kind of design that emerged from experience, from engineers who had learned through trial and error what could be stripped away and what was essential. As the afternoon wore on, more details emerged that deepened the sense of unease among the inspection team. The hydraulic lines were thin-walled tubing, barely adequate for the pressures they carried, routed along the exterior of structural members where they were exposed to battle damage. A single bullet strike could disable the entire system, leaving the crew unable to extend landing gear or operate flaps. The fuel lines were similarly vulnerable, running through unprotected areas of the fuselage where any penetration would result in catastrophic leakage. The landing gear itself was a marvel of lightweight construction, using minimal materials to achieve surprising strength. But the tolerance for error was non-existent. The struts were designed to handle the stress of normal landings on prepared runways, nothing more. A hard landing on rough terrain, the kind that American bombers could survive with bent struts and damaged tires, would likely cause this aircraft to collapse entirely. Every system, every component, existed at the absolute minimum threshold of functionality, operating in a narrow band between adequate performance and complete failure. Hartley watched as an engineer examined the bomb release mechanism, testing its operation with careful movements. The system worked smoothly, each component moving with precision, but there was no redundancy, no backup if the primary mechanism jammed. He thought of American bombers with their multiple release systems, their manual overrides and emergency procedures, their layers of fail-safe mechanisms designed to ensure that ordnance could be dropped even if primary systems failed. The Japanese had built a machine that worked perfectly or not at all, a binary approach that left no room for the chaos and unpredictability of combat. The communication equipment was equally minimal, a single radio set with limited range and no backup frequencies. If the primary radio failed, the crew would be flying in complete isolation, unable to coordinate with other aircraft or receive updated orders from ground control. American bombers carried multiple radio sets, intercoms that connected every crew position, even signal lamps and flare guns for emergency communication. The Japanese crew would be dependent on visual signals and prearranged plans, operating in silence if their single radio failed. By late afternoon, the inspection team had compiled a catalog of vulnerabilities that seemed almost suicidal in their comprehensiveness. The aircraft had no armor protecting the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no redundant control systems, no backup hydraulics, no emergency power, no fire suppression equipment beyond a handful of small extinguishers. It was a machine stripped of every safety feature, every protective measure, every backup system that American designers considered essential. The question that haunted Hartley was whether this represented desperation or philosophy, whether the Japanese had been forced into these compromises by lack of resources or had chosen them deliberately as part of a different understanding of warfare. The quality of the construction suggested the latter. Despite the thinness of the materials, despite the absence of protective systems, the workmanship was excellent. The rivets were precisely placed and properly formed. The welds were clean and strong. The surfaces were finished smoothly to reduce drag. The overall assembly showed attention to detail and pride in craftsmanship. This was not the work of a desperate nation throwing together machines from whatever materials were available. This was deliberate, methodical, the product of skilled workers executing a carefully considered design. O'Brien discovered markings inside the fuselage, characters in Japanese that he could not read, but that suggested manufacturing dates and quality control inspections. The dates indicated the aircraft was relatively new, built within the past year, which meant these design choices were not relics of earlier thinking, but represented current Japanese engineering philosophy. They were still building bombers this way, still sending crews into combat in machines that could be destroyed by weapons that would merely damage their American counterparts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the airstrip, Hartley stood alone beside the bomber, his hand resting on the thin metal skin. He thought about the pilot who had flown this aircraft, wondering if the man had survived the forced landing or perished in the crash. He wondered what thoughts had gone through that pilot's mind during his final approach, whether he had felt fear or resignation, or simply focused on the mechanical task of bringing the damaged aircraft down. He wondered if Japanese pilots discussed among themselves the vulnerability of their machines, if they complained or accepted it as part of their duty, if they understood they were being asked to sacrifice more than American pilots would ever be asked to give. The next morning, a team of specialists arrived to disassemble the aircraft for shipment back to the United States, where it would undergo more detailed analysis in controlled laboratory conditions. Hartley watched as they began removing panels and disconnecting systems, methodically taking apart what Japanese workers had methodically assembled. The process felt almost sacrilegious, like desecrating a grave, though he could not articulate why. Perhaps it was the recognition that this machine represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, the accumulated knowledge of engineers and craftsmen who had poured their expertise into creating something that would likely be destroyed within hours of entering combat. The fuselage section was lifted onto a truck bed, and Hartley could see through the open structure to the other side, the ribs and stringers creating a lattice of metal that seemed impossibly delicate to have flown through combat skies. Workers wrapped the sections in protective coverings, handling them with care despite knowing they came from an enemy aircraft. There was a professional respect among the men, an acknowledgement that good engineering deserved recognition regardless of which side had produced it. Over the following days, as the bomber was prepared for transport, Hartley flew additional missions, engaging Japanese aircraft over various targets throughout the Philippines. The knowledge from the inspection changed everything. He no longer saw enemy bombers as formidable threats, but as fragile targets, machines that could be destroyed with minimal effort if approached correctly. He adjusted his tactics, aiming for fuel tanks and control surfaces rather than attempting to saturate the fuselage with bullets. His kill rate increased dramatically, as did that of other pilots who had attended the inspection briefings. But the increased effectiveness brought no satisfaction, only a growing sense of unease. Each bomber that fell in flames, each crew that went down without parachutes appearing in the slipstream, reinforced the reality that he was not fighting against well-protected enemies, but against men flying in machines that offered virtually no protection. It felt less like combat and more like execution, a systematic destruction of opponents who had been sent into battle without adequate equipment. The propaganda image of fanatical enemies choosing death over surrender gave way to a more troubling reality of soldiers following orders, despite knowing those orders were likely suicidal. Intelligence reports began circulating that corroborated what the inspection had revealed. Prisoner interrogations indicated that Japanese aircrew were fully aware of their aircraft's vulnerabilities. They knew about the paper-thin skin, the unarmored fuel tanks, the lack of protective systems. They flew anyway, not because they were ignorant of the risks, but because duty demanded it, because their culture placed honor and obligation above personal survival. This knowledge created a strange cognitive dissonance among American pilots who had been taught to see the enemy as fundamentally different, as operating under alien logic. But the more they learned, the more it became clear that Japanese pilots were simply men doing their jobs under impossible circumstances, not so different from themselves, except in the resources their nations could provide. Hartley began keeping a journal, recording his observations and reflections in cramped handwriting late at night in his quarters. He wrote about the bomber inspection, about the feel of the thin metal under his palm, about the faces of Japanese pilots in photographs recovered from crash sites. He wrote about his own missions, the moments when he lined up a bomber in his sights and squeezed the trigger, watching the thin skin disintegrate under the impact of .50 caliber rounds. He wrote about the moral ambiguity of fighting an enemy who was simultaneously dangerous and vulnerable, about the uncomfortable realization that technical superiority did not necessarily equate to moral superiority. The journal became a repository for questions he could not ask his squadron mates, thoughts that would have been considered defeatist or sympathetic to the enemy. He wondered what American bombers would look like if the United States had been forced to operate under Japanese resource constraints, if American engineers had been required to maximize range and speed at any cost. Would American crews have accepted flying an unarmored aircraft? Would American culture have produced pilots willing to take such risks? Or would the entire strategic approach have been different, shaped by different values and different assumptions about what soldiers could reasonably be asked to endure? Months passed, and the war moved north toward the Japanese home islands. American forces captured more aircraft, and each inspection revealed similar design philosophies. The pattern was consistent across different aircraft types and manufacturers, suggesting a unified strategic approach rather than individual design choices. Japanese military aviation had made a conscious decision to prioritize offensive capability over defensive protection, to build aircraft that could strike deep and strike hard, but that could not survive sustained combat. It was a gamble that had paid dividends in the early months of the war, when surprise and superior pilot training had carried the day. But that was now proving catastrophic, as American numbers and industrial capacity overwhelmed Japanese forces. Hartley received orders to rotate back to the United States for a training assignment, helping to prepare the next generation of pilots for combat. Before leaving the Philippines, he made one final visit to the site where the captured bomber had been inspected, now empty except for a few fragments of metal and some oil stains in the dirt. He stood in the spot where the aircraft had rested, trying to recall the exact sensation of touching that thin skin, wanting to preserve the memory against the inevitable fading that time would bring. The journey home took weeks, a slow progression across the Pacific aboard a transport ship crowded with men rotating out of combat zones. Hartley spent hours on deck, watching the ocean pass beneath the ship's hull, thinking about the war and what it had revealed about human nature and national character. He thought about the Japanese engineers who had designed the bomber, wondering if they had struggled with the moral implications of their choices or simply accepted them as necessary. He thought about the American engineers who had designed his fighter with its armor plating and self-sealing tanks, and wondered if they understood how their choices reflected American assumptions about the value of individual lives. Stateside, he found himself assigned to a training facility in Nevada, teaching young pilots the lessons learned in combat. During one lecture, he described the inspection of the captured bomber, showing photographs of the thin metal skin and explaining the tactical implications. He watched the faces of the student pilots as they absorbed the information, seeing the same mixture of disbelief and unease that he had felt during the initial inspection. One student asked why the Japanese would build such vulnerable aircraft, and Hartley found himself unable to provide a simple answer. He talked about resource constraints and engineering trade-offs, about strategic priorities and cultural differences, but none of it fully captured the complexity of what he had witnessed. After the lecture, a senior officer approached him, an admiral who had flown combat missions in the First World War and now worked in aircraft procurement. The admiral had read the inspection reports and wanted to discuss their implications for American aircraft design. They talked for hours, debating whether American bombers were over-engineered, whether the weight of armor and defensive systems reduced effectiveness, whether a middle ground existed between Japanese vulnerability and American protection. The admiral argued that crew survivability was paramount, that no mission was worth sacrificing trained aircrew, that the long-term success of American aviation depended on keeping experienced pilots alive. Hartley found himself unable to disagree, yet he could not shake the image of those Japanese bombers pressing forward through defensive fire, accomplishing their missions despite catastrophic losses. The war ended in August 1945 with the dropping of atomic bombs and the subsequent Japanese surrender. Hartley remained in the service, transitioning to peacetime duties that involved evaluating captured Japanese aircraft and incorporating lessons learned into American designs. He traveled to Japan as part of the occupation forces, visiting aircraft factories and interviewing Japanese engineers. In a design bureau in Nagoya, he met the chief engineer who had worked on the bomber he had inspected in the Philippines. The man spoke little English, but through an interpreter, they discussed the design philosophy that had produced such vulnerable aircraft. The engineer explained that Japanese strategic thinking had been shaped by the vast distances of the Pacific and the limited industrial capacity available for aircraft production. They had calculated that achieving the necessary range to strike American bases required minimizing weight at every opportunity. They had known the aircraft would be vulnerable, had understood that crew losses would be high, but had concluded that accomplishing the mission was more important than protecting individual crews. It was a cold calculation, delivered without emotion or apology, a simple statement of strategic reality as Japanese planners had understood it. Hartley asked if the engineer had struggled with the moral implications of designing aircraft that offered crews so little protection. The man was silent for a moment before responding through the interpreter. He said that in wartime, engineers did not have the luxury of moral qualms. They solved the problems presented to them using the resources available, making the best choices they could under impossible constraints. He said that every engineer wished they could provide better protection for crews, but wishing did not change the fundamental realities of physics and material science. The bomber had been designed to fulfill a specific strategic requirement, and within those parameters it had been successful, at least until American industrial capacity had shifted the balance of power. The conversation stayed with Hartley long after he returned to the United States.
He realized that the paper-thin skin of that captured bomber represented something larger than engineering trade-offs or strategic priorities. It represented the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War, the collision between a nation with vast resources and a nation forced to operate within severe constraints. The Japanese had gambled that quality and determination could overcome quantitative disadvantages, that superior training and tactical skill could compensate for inferior equipment. For a time, the gamble had succeeded, but ultimately, no amount of courage or skill could overcome the grinding arithmetic of American industrial production.
Years later, when Hartley had retired from the service and was living quietly in a small town in Oregon, he received a letter from O'Brien, the engineer who had measured the bomber's skin thickness during that inspection in the Philippines. O'Brien had gone on to a career in aerospace engineering and wanted to share something he had discovered. He had been researching the history of the bomber they had inspected and had learned that the specific aircraft had flown 27 combat missions before being forced down, a remarkable record of survival given its vulnerability. The crew had been experienced, having survived when so many others had perished, their skill and luck somehow overcoming the fundamental fragility of their machine. The letter concluded with a reflection that captured what Hartley himself had been thinking for years. O'Brien wrote that the paper-thin skin had taught him more about war than any textbook or after-action report. It had shown him that engineering was never purely technical, that every design choice carried moral weight, that the machines we build reflect our values and priorities in ways we might not fully understand until we see them through enemy eyes. He wrote that he thought often about the Japanese crews who had flown in those fragile bombers, about their courage and their acceptance of risks that American culture would have considered unacceptable, about what it meant that two nations could look at the same problem and arrive at such radically different solutions. Hartley folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with his old journal and photographs from the war. He had not looked at those materials in years, but now he found himself reading through the journal entries, reliving those months in the Pacific when the world had seemed both vast and claustrophobic, when every day brought new revelations about the nature of warfare and human endurance. The entry about the bomber inspection was longer than he remembered, filled with observations and questions that his younger self had struggled to articulate. He realized that the captured bomber had marked a turning point in his understanding of the war, the moment when the enemy had ceased to be an abstraction and become instead a reflection of different choices made under different circumstances. The paper-thin skin had been both a vulnerability and a statement, a declaration that some nations would accept costs that others would not, that strategic necessity could override concerns about individual survival, that war forced impossible choices and then judged nations by the choices they made. Continue exploring the quiet contradictions that define humanity's darkest hours.